Well, every year, on the Sunday after Easter, we preachers get the exact same gospel passage. Every year we get Thomas, who is unfairly labeled as what? Doubting Thomas. That name just stuck. And sometimes that happens, doesn't it? You get that nickname and you just never get out from under it. Thomas gets beat up on this Sunday every single year by preachers around the country and around the world. The poor guy's been mistreated and made an example of bad behavior for a couple thousand years now. So today, maybe we can cut him a little bit of slack. I think maybe one of the reasons we like to beat up on Thomas so much is because we want somebody we can blame, somebody we can point to as an example of what not to do. And if we can point to somebody as an example of what not to do, that gives us the ability then to feel better about what we do, right? Because if we can say, well, at least I believe more than so-and-so, or at least I don't act like so-and-so, then I'm in better shape. And I realize that escalated pretty quickly into the sermon, so sorry about that. But we do like to have those people that we can point to and blame, and I think there's something to that. But I think there's something more to this story also, and I think Thomas deserves a little bit better in our treatment of him. So today, and this is probably no surprise if you're here often, I may come at this a little differently than you're used to hearing with Thomas. But I think Thomas not only gets a bad rap, but I think the idea of doubt gets disparaged unfairly as well. I think doubt gets a bad rap when we look at Thomas's story. I think maybe we need to update our understanding of doubt and the relationship between doubt and the rest of our spiritual life. See, the problem is that we often place doubt as the exact opposite of faith, as if only one of those things really can exist in us at a time, and if we're doubting, then we're not having faith. The problem is that if we understand doubt as the opposite of faith, that means that we're equating faith with certainty. And certainty doesn't really leave a lot of room for faith, does it? Doesn't even seem to require a lot of faith. Because if we're certain about something, we don't have to have faith. We just know it. We know it's going to be true. We know it's going to happen. And let's be honest, that's not really the way a lot of this stuff when it comes to Christianity and faith and spiritual things works. We'd like to have some certainty, but the truth is that a lot of it is that we have to take on faith. Believing what we have heard and trusting that it's going to play out that way. I came across this week an author who I'm going to have to read. His name was Leslie Dixon Weatherhead, and he was a British Methodist pastor who wrote a book titled The Christian Agnostic. I haven't looked for you, but I'm going to find and read that book because what an intriguing title. Because we've been taught all along that to be agnostic is bad, right? Atheist is worse, but agnostic is bad enough. Weatherhead doesn't see it that way. Because if you really get down to it, to the heart of that word, agnostic really means an acknowledgement that we don't know and maybe can't know. At least not to the degree of certainty that we might like to have with some other things. And Weatherhead says, I trust in the areas of my life where I am not certain. Because where we're not certain, what else do we have but trust, faith, hope, those things that are anchored in something. It's not blind, but it's anchored in something that we aren't necessarily certain of, but we believe enough to trust that it's going to play out that way. And I think once we can get past the idea that we have to be certain, then it allows us to embrace the mystery of faith and of God and of ideas like resurrection and grace. And once we allow for mystery, then we allow for surprise and delight and maybe even joy, which is exactly what Jesus told his disciples before his death that they would feel when they realized that he was alive again, that their grief would turn to rejoicing. That rejoicing requires us, I think, to allow room for mystery and surprise and grace and things that we can't explain with certainty. Because in this embrace of mystery, we have to allow room for doubt, for questions, for wonder, for acceptance of what we cannot understand or explain very well sometimes. Like I'm doing here, not explaining well sometimes. We have to allow that room, that mystery. A writer named Wilson Meisner said, I respect faith, but doubt is what gets you an education. And there's some truth to that. Peter Woods is a South African Methodist pastor and writer who I've quoted a few times before, and I was reading what he had to say about this week, and he points to René Descartes as the one who began to move us from mystery to certainty. The idea of thinking being what tells us what really is real. And he says, and with that movement, doubt became a bad thing, something to be avoided and overcome. He writes that Descartes began the movement in the West away from mystery to certainty, which was great for science, but sad for spirituality, because he moved the locus of consciousness from the heart to the head. It has remained there ever since. If we can allow ourselves to get away from our compulsive need for certainty in all things for just a little while, then we might get an opportunity to truly meet the risen Lord and even to experience that resurrection in our own lives. But I think it requires that move from certainty into faith. And I think Thomas's story can help us with that some. Now to start, let's work on another word. And that is the idea of faith or belief in the way that John uses it. Now in a few minutes, this may get a little muddled. This came to me Friday morning, so I'm going to do my best on this one. So stick with me on this. In a few minutes, whenever I stop talking, we're going to say the Apostles' Creed together. Our affirmation of our faith. We're going to affirm what we say we believe. And when we do that, it's going to sound a lot like we're reciting a list of theological tenets that we hold to, almost like a checklist. Yep, believe that, believe that, believe that, believe that. And to a degree, I guess that is what we're doing. John, in his gospel, would have not really approved of the idea of a list of things that we check off that we believe. Because to John, belief, faith, equals trust and relationship more than it means this intellectual assent to something. You believe in the person more than in a set of ideals or creedal statements. I mean, John is a heavily theological book. You go all the way back to John chapter 1, where John says the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and the Word pre-existed everything else. It's the Logos, the Word of God. And that's heavily theological, but it's also relationship, isn't it? The Word was where? With God. And if you begin to then move through Jesus' ministry in the Gospel of John, everybody who comes to faith comes to relationship. Belief is always seen in the context of a relationship. And even then that expands to the relationship not just with God, but with those around. Nicodemus comes to Jesus in John chapter 3, wants to know about how to experience this new life. And what does Jesus tell him he has to do? He has to be born again. What does being birthed do? It puts you in relationships. It puts you in a nuclear family. It puts you in the human family. It is all belief. Faith is relational in John. So I wonder, if we think of faith that way, how does that affect what we say in a little while when we say the Apostles' Creed? Keep that in mind as we move on a little bit here. Because here's the question for you, and I don't want you to answer this one for me. I just want you to think about it. How many of you, when you say the words of the Creed, are able to say, I believe every single word just as it's there? Just the whole thing. I'm good. I suspect that there would be quite a few people who would not answer yes to that. And that might be a problem for us to be concerned with if we're thinking of this as a checklist. That you have to get all of these things just right for your faith to be okay. But if we see our faith, our belief, not so much in terms of theological terms, but rather in relationship, then we might begin to see our creed as our effort not to define God, but to explain God in relation to creation. To tell somehow, in our own weak efforts, the story of how God has dealt with people. Faith as relationship. Now, part of the reason I bring this up is that I suspect that there are some of us in the room who, as we're going through the creed, might have trouble with a line or two. It might be God the Father. That word might trip you up. It might be the virgin birth. It might be descended into hell. Whatever it may be, I suspect that there are some who get to those words, those lines, and maybe struggle with them. Maybe you stop at that point and then pick it back up again when it gets past that. But here's the thing. That's okay. Because this is not about signing off on every single line of it, checking every box. That's not faith according to John. And I don't think it's faith according to God either. Because faith, belief, is about this relationship with God and even with each other, right? Because what? We don't say that creed on our own. We say that creed how? Together. And I might struggle with one part that you don't, and you might struggle with one part that I don't, because our faith is something we live out in community, in relationship, together. I think that's the way that John wants us to understand what we're looking at when we have questions about doubt and faith. And that leads us to the other reason why I wanted to bring up this idea, and that is that maybe we understand Thomas better if we understand his struggle in terms of relationships, not of apologetics, not of an attempt to define and explain and prove right, but in terms of a relationship with someone who has lost his Lord and his friend and is struggling with that. And faith comes through that. Well, the story you've heard, the day of the resurrection, the women come and they tell the disciples they've seen Jesus alive. The disciples have trouble with that. They don't know that they can believe that. So where do we find them? We find them in a locked room because they're afraid that the political and religious leaders are going to come after them as well. They're going to come find them and blame them for Jesus being missing from the tomb. And perhaps they're going to suffer the same fate. And in that locked room, where some of them are, Jesus appears, showing that a locked door is not enough to keep him out. He appears and he says to them, "Peace be with you." And I don't know if you caught this when we read it, but the next thing he does is he shows them his hands and his side. He shows them his wounds. And John says, then they recognized, then they believed that it was Jesus. Hold on to that. And remember that when we get to Thomas asking for that. We blame Thomas for asking what they'd already seen. He only wanted the same thing they had. Well, they come, and there's a lot here too, because the words about if you forgive people, they're forgiven. If you don't, they're not. I'm not going to touch that, because I'm not even sure where we would go with that part of it. Maybe next year. We get this again next year. But as that happens, then we're told Thomas isn't there. So they go to Thomas with the good news. We don't know why Thomas is there. Maybe his way of dealing with grief was just to get back to life. Maybe after all of this time of following Jesus around, it seems like it's over, so it's time to go back to work. Time to go back to home. Time to pick back up all those things that he hasn't been doing. But the disciples go and they find him. And they tell him what they've seen, and then those famous words. Those words that have him branded as Doubting Thomas. Unless I see his hands and touch him, unless I see the wound in his side, I'm not going to believe. But here's the thing you need to notice there. Apparently the disciples keep meeting, and guess who keeps meeting with them? Because when Jesus comes a week later, who's there? Thomas is. He's having trouble with this, but not so much trouble that he's not going to stick around and see what happens. Not so much trouble that he can't stay and wait and hope that maybe he too will get reunited with this one that he's lost. See, I think that all actually from Thomas is not doubt and not cowardly, but actually rather courageous. He held on. He kept gathering with the disciples. He kept believing as much as he could, kept waiting for the truth to appear, waiting for Jesus to appear. I think what he's doing is very much like that one affirmation of faith that we read elsewhere in the Gospels of the Father who says to Jesus, "I believe, help my unbelief," which may be the greatest statement, affirmation of faith ever. I think that's kind of what we see with Thomas. I believe, but I need help with my unbelief, and I'm going to stay here with these other people who believe, because if I'm among people who believe enough, maybe I can believe too. And if I stay here among those who saw Jesus enough, maybe I'll see Jesus too. That's an act of faith. That's an act of courage. That's not doubt necessarily as much as it is a desire to really know. And like I said, he's only wanting to see what they've already seen. It's rather unfair to punish him for asking for that, isn't it? Because the truth is, we're all there. We're all wanting to see what we haven't seen yet. We're all wanting to know what we haven't known yet. And we're all in that difficult place of waiting. All of us know what that's like, right? The struggle to wait for an answer. The struggle to wait for God to truly appear. But if there's one thing we can definitely learn from Thomas, it is that the best place to wait is among other people who are waiting. Or other people who have something that we need. See, doubt, I don't think, is necessarily a bad thing. And certainty is probably not the right goal for us, at least in terms of faith. Because belief is about relationships and is rewarded in relationships, and the truth is that relationships sometimes don't have a lot of certainty because they require some faith. Which leads me to two takeaways, I think, for us today that I want us to be able to hold on to as we leave and take Thomas's story and take this idea of doubt and faith and how they work together and put them to practice in our lives and in our life. And the first one is this. We meet the risen Christ most often and most fully in community. The disciples were together when Jesus appeared to them. And they were together again when Jesus came again. And Thomas met Jesus not on his own, but in community. Among those who also struggled, who also were waiting, who also needed each other. Because that's the thing about faith and about life in Christ, is that it is not just a personal thing. It is a community thing, isn't it? Because no one of us in this room is going to always have all the faith that we need. Every one of us in this room is going to go through a period or periods where we don't know that we can trust anymore. So the best place to be, to find what we need, to find life and assurance and help and faith even, is among a community of faith, where we can lean on other people's faith. We can lean on other people's belief when our own is maybe not quite enough. I think that's what Thomas did. And he was rewarded for staying in that relationship, for staying in that community, by finally getting to see and meet the risen Lord too. We want to see the risen Lord. We want to know resurrection. We want to know new life. Find it together. Find it in community, in shared life. And I think the other thing, and I didn't spend a lot of time on it in the sermon, but the other thing I think we need to remember about this relates very closely to what I just said, and that is that we see the risen Christ most clearly through our wounds, through our weakness, through our vulnerability. When Jesus appeared the first time to the disciples, it wasn't his appearance that convinced them, was it? It wasn't the fact that they're in a locked room and all of a sudden Jesus is there. It was his wounds. It was his injuries. Not scars, wounds. Signs of what? Of weakness, of damage, of hurt. Jesus appeared to them as the wounded Messiah. His injuries still very evident. As we are seeking together to know the risen Christ, to know new life, we will find that when we're honest about our own weaknesses, about our own hurts, when we feel safe to do that together as we wait. Because here's the thing, and I really believe this. Jesus' wounds were evidence of his resurrection. Our wounds are opportunities for resurrection. Opportunities for new life. Opportunities for healing. Opportunities for help, for growth. Now, instead of bashing Thomas for doubting, perhaps we should celebrate Thomas for showing us ourselves, for being who we are. Maybe we can then be honest about our own doubts and stick together to seek the risen Christ in community, in the face, embracing our hurts, our struggles, and waiting together for the resurrection to appear. Because resurrection was not a one-time thing. Resurrection happens around us every day. May we wait together for that. May we experience that together. May we live that and share that together. Even when we don't. Let's pray. Almighty God, we recognize and we